In my last video on the top 4 American outlaws, I ranked Jesse James as America's #1 outlaw. I've been fascinated with Jesse James for a long time. I definitely don't condone his crimes or actions during the Civil War and post-Civil War, but I was fascinated with his ability to capture the public and remain an iconic subject of Americana folklore. He still holds a firm grasp on one of the most recognized American figures in history. His life was filled with violence from a young age until his death. The story of his life is fascinating, however, the story of his death, much like his life, have reached mythological proportions. His death also cascaded through his former associates and split the contemporary opinion on what and who Jesse James represented. It is believed the James gang and James killed 17 men over his career and amassed a pretty decent fortune from train and bank robberies in an outlaw career that lasted from 1868 to 1881. James learned how to elude authorities and lawmen throughout the South and Midwest as a bushwhacker in the brutal Missouri militia during the Civil War. James was forged in violence from a young age. He was ardently pro-Confederate throughout his life, and this philosophy fueled his personal war on the banks and trains he robbed. Additionally, he had cultivated a system of allies and family members that would hide and cover for the gang when needed. He also built relationships with sympathetic Southern newspaper editors that built a Robin Hood figure still fighting the Union in a never-ending Civil War. However, this story is not about Jesse James' career in life, as stated before, but more focused on his downfall and ultimate demise, and the aftermath of the men that killed the notorious outlaw. Previous to the final train robbery of the James gang was the botched robbery of a bank in Northfield, Minnesota. The job figuratively and literally took the life out of the gang. Only Jesse and Frank James, who was Jesse's older brother, would ultimately survive the attempted robbery. For what would become the last train robbery of the James gang, many of the long-standing members had not made it out of Minnesota or had simply fled the gang to avoid the law. On September 7, 1880 at Blue Cut, Missouri, Jesse and a rabble of backwoods Missouri and Kentucky associates robbed a train as it moved its way through the Missouri countryside. The robbery was somewhat successful with a modest take, but nothing that compared to the gang's earlier hauls in their heydays of the late 1860s and early 1870s. Bob and Charlie Ford were part of this rabble that was part of the Blue Cut robbery. The two men would cement themselves in the legacy of Jesse James from this point forward. Charlie, Bob's older brother, was believed to be part of the actual robbery. After the robbery, Frank James left the gang and moved to Virginia. At this point, the James gang was all but dissolved. The Ford brothers were the only two that would hang around the orbit of Jesse for the next few years. It would not be long before Bob and Charlie were plotting to put an end to the outlaw. Governor Thomas Crittenden of Missouri had had enough of outlaws, and especially Jesse James in the state of Missouri. Crittenden was a colonel in the Missouri militia on the Union side, the exact enemy that Jesse was continuously fighting against after the Civil War. Shortly after becoming governor in 1881, he placed a $5,000 bounty on the James gang, hoping to curtail the violence and robberies. However, the beginning of the end for Jesse and the culmination of the Ford betrayal began with the killing of one Wood Height. Wood Height was Jesse's cousin and had been a long-standing member of the James gang as well as a former Missouri bushwhacker. Dick Little, another James gang associate, was a rival of Wood Height's and had been dueling for the affections of one Martha Bolton, who was the sister of the Ford brothers. In December of 1881, Robert Ford and Dick Little were staying at the Bolton farm, which was a common hideout for the James gang throughout the years. Little and Height confronted each other in the kitchen of the Bolton farmhouse. An argument ensued over the payouts from the Blue Cut robbery. Height claimed that Little stole $100 from him. As the tension built in the kitchen, both men raised their guns and fired. Little was hit in the leg while Height was hit in the arm. Both men fired until their weapons were empty. As Height went for his second gun to finish the job, Robert Ford lifted his revolver and blasted Height in the back of the head dropping him to the floor. Woodhite's body was buried in the woods outside the Bolton farm. The murder of Jesse's first cousin would sure bring the vengeful ire of the outlaw, something Dick Little feared. Jesse wrote to another relative at the time that he felt that Little was going to betray him anyway. He was also at this time unaware that Woodhite was dead, and that Bob and Charlie Ford had already been discussing a deal to take him out. Bob Ford had met with Missouri officials to work out a deal in January of 1882. The deal would be for the $5,000 bounty, as well as a pardon for Dick Little and a pardon for the Ford brothers in the murder of Jesse James. Little would eventually turn himself in to the authorities and begin to talk about the James gang. This all occurred in January of 1882, and at this point the only person that Jesse truly trusted was Charlie Ford. Throughout the winter of 1882, him and Charlie were scouting robbery targets through Kansas and Missouri, and Jesse began probing Charlie about who to recruit for their new jobs. Charlie suggested his brother Bob Ford. Bob and Charlie moved into Jesse James' residence in St. Joseph's, Missouri. Jesse was using Thomas Howard as an alias at this time. The Fords lived with Jesse and acted as companions and bodyguards of sorts as they discussed new plans and robberies. Little's confession leaked to the press on April 3, 1882. The Fords realized that they were going to have to make a move sooner rather than later. Jesse was on to them after reading the article in the newspaper on the morning of April 3rd. It's hard to speculate what truly happened after the morning meal that concluded on that day. However, the Fords testified that Jesse removed his guns and went to adjust a picture on the wall, turning his back on the two brothers. Bob Ford knew this was the moment. He pulled a revolver and fired, hitting Jesse James in the back of the head and dropped him to the floor. After the murder, they were tried and convicted of the murder of Jesse James, then sentenced to hang. Crittenden then pardoned them as part of the deal. However, they did not receive anywhere near the full amount of reward money. Ford capitalized on his minor celebrity status by posing for photos, and even going as far as recreating the killing on stages in New York. His brother contracted tuberculosis and took his own life in 1884. Robert Ford then reconnected with Dick Little, and the two opened a saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico, famous for being the hometown of Billy the Kid. However, Ford allegedly was run out of town after losing a shooting contest with a local gunslinger. At this time as well, Bob Ford was becoming more and more unpopular, as the mythological specter of Jesse James still hung over his head. James was still seen as a hero to many in Missouri. Ford was seen as a coward. He found himself surviving an assassination attempt in St. Louis in 1889. After kicking around Colorado in the early 1890s, Ford ended up operating a saloon in the mineral-rich boomtown of Creede, Colorado. On June 8, 1892, a man named Edward Kelly walked into Bob's saloon, looking him straight in the face, and said, "Hello, Bob," and let loose both barrels of the shotgun. Bob Ford lay dead on the floor of his Creede saloon. Kelly would eventually be released after a 7,000-name petition was submitted begging for his release. However, Kelly would become known as the man who killed Jesse James. He would be killed himself after trying to shoot down a policeman in 1904. Dick Little seemingly ended up coming out as the most successful member of the former James gang in the end. He became a wealthy horse trainer and thoroughbred owner and passed away of a heart attack in Kentucky in 1901. Sadly, Jesse's family was left with nothing. A small sale was held by his wife of the possessions within the house. Unfortunately, the sale made less than $120. There is a rumor of Jesse James' treasure still buried somewhere, but there is no evidence that this is true. However, the owner of the house began almost immediately to sell tickets to see the spot where Jesse James was killed and made several $100s. The house continues as a museum to this day. One of my favorite books and movies is The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. And the movie stars Brad Pitt as Jesse James and Casey Affleck as Bob Ford. It's fictional but pretty accurate retelling of the end of the James gang and the eventual death of Jesse James, and his relationship with Ford and how Ford experienced life after the killing. The real events of the last several years of the James gang are dramatic as any fictional story. It's one of my favorite stories from history. If you haven't read The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford or seen the same movie of the same name, I would highly recommend them. Thank you again for watching this video from Everything Has History. Please comment, like, and subscribe to my channel. And I will see you on the next episode from Everything Has History.